The room had no windows. Margaret had chosen it that way, a back bedroom in the farmhouse she'd purchased under a shell company 14 years ago, used twice for work retreats, and never mentioned to anyone since. The walls were bare. The air smelled of cedar and old paper. A single lamp threw yellow light across the folding table where a laptop sat open, its screen the only living thing in the room. On the screen, a funeral. Her funeral. She watched the black-clad figures move across the frame, the slow procession, the white lilies she had specified in the arrangements, the mahogany casket she had selected herself from a catalog Ruth had quietly brought to her 6 weeks ago. She had chosen mahogany because it was dignified, because it was what she would have wanted. She had not anticipated how strange it would feel to watch her own burial from a folding chair in a farmhouse 40 miles outside Atlanta, wearing yesterday's clothes, with a cold cup of coffee beside her hand. Margaret Calloway, 61 years old, founder and former CEO of Calloway Group, a logistics and real estate firm headquartered in Atlanta with a 30-year footprint across the Southeast, was dead. Except she wasn't. She had staged every detail with the precision she brought to quarterly earnings calls. Dr. Harmon, her physician of 20 years and one of 2 people alive who knew the truth, had filed the death certificate. Cardiac event, sudden onset, no prior indication. It happened sometimes, he'd told the hospital administrator, to women who worked too hard and rested too little. Nobody questioned it. Nobody questioned Margaret Calloway. Even in death, Ruth Ellison, her attorney for 18 years and the second person who knew, had handled the legal architecture. The announcement. The initial estate freeze. The carefully worded statement to the press that said beloved businesswoman and lasting legacy and nothing that wasn't true. The plan was simple. Margaret would watch, James would act, and she would finally know. She had told herself it was necessary, that after years of phone calls that lasted 4 minutes, of holidays spent in the same house with a son who looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't solved yet, of watching him quietly withdraw from everything she had built, she needed to know if any of it had mattered to him. If she had mattered. On the screen, the camera Ruth had arranged near the entrance caught James arriving. He was alone. He wore a dark gray suit, not black. His face was calm, not composed in the way of someone fighting, simply calm, the way a lake is calm in November, cold, all the way down. He shook hands with the funeral director. He nodded at 2 distant relatives. Margaret barely recognized herself. He did not weep. He did not press his face into his hands. He walked to the casket and stood there, and that was all. Margaret leaned forward. She had known James for 32 years. She had held him when he was 4 hours old and still unnamed, had watched him learn to walk in the kitchen of their first real house, had sat beside his hospital bed when he was 7, and running a fever that scared her more than any business crisis ever had. She knew the set of his shoulders when he was tired. She knew the way his jaw tightened when he was holding something in. She did not know what she was looking at now. She watched him stand beside the casket until everyone else had drifted toward the reception area. She watched the funeral home staff begin to dim the lights, moving through the room with the practiced invisibility of their profession. She watched James stay. He was the last one in the room. He placed his hand on the casket lid, just his hand, flat against the wood, and he stood there in the half-dark and did not move for a long time. Margaret sat back. She had expected grief or greed. She had not expected this stillness that told her nothing and somehow everything at once. Her chest was doing something she hadn't felt in years. She picked up the coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down again. She had wanted to know what he would do without her. She was beginning to wonder if she had asked the wrong question. Margaret Calloway had grown up in a 2-room apartment in South Baltimore, the daughter of a man who drank steadily and a woman who left quietly when Margaret was 9. She had learned early that the world did not owe her softness, and she had made peace with that lesson faster than most. By 16, she was working. By 23, she had her first business. By 38, she was the woman on the magazine cover. She did not talk about South Baltimore. She had left it so completely that sometimes she forgot the specific texture of it, the smell of the hallway, the sound of upstairs neighbors, the cold that came through the window. She'd stuffed with newspaper one January because there was no money for weather stripping. She had filed those years away, in a part of herself she kept locked, and she told herself it was healthy, practical. You couldn't carry the past and build the future with the same hands. What she hadn't accounted for was that the past has a way of leaking. It leaked into the way she loved her son fiercely, completely, and with a terrified grip that had nothing to do with James and everything to do with a 9-year-old girl who had learned that people leave. She had promised herself, in the hospital the night James was born 6 weeks early, that he would never have what she'd had. No cold winters, no empty refrigerators, no mother who disappeared. She would be there. She would make sure. She would give him everything she'd had to build herself, pre-assembled, no suffering required. She had not understood, until much later, that the suffering was sometimes the point. James had grown up with the best of everything and the weight of all of it. Good schools that came with expectations, opportunities that arrived pre-labeled with the name of what he was supposed to want. A mother who loved him with such force that there was no room in the equation for him to fail, which meant, though she wouldn't have said it this way, no room for him to be real. He had been a quiet child, watchful. He laughed easily when he forgot to be careful, and then seemed to remember something and pulled it back. Margaret had thought, for years, that he was simply reserved, introverted, like her, in some ways. It was only recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, as the distance between them had calcified from cool to cold, that she'd begun to feel the particular shape of his absence. Not just that he called less, not just that holidays felt like business meetings, but something more particular, that James, in her presence, was always slightly braced, always slightly waiting for something. She had interpreted that as indifference, had told herself and Ruth, over the years, in fragments, that the money had changed him, that comfort had made him soft in the wrong places and hard in the wrong places, that he didn't care about what she'd built because he hadn't had to fight for any of it. She had needed to believe that, because the alternative, that she had something to do with the distance, was a door she didn't know how to open. The last time they had laughed together, genuinely, without agenda, was 6 years ago, a Sunday morning, coffee on the kitchen table, something forgettable on the radio. James had made a dry comment about the weather forecast, and she had laughed before she could perform, not laughing, and for a few minutes it had been easy in the way it used to be, before she understood how rare easy had become. Then she had told him she'd scheduled a meeting for him with the Hartfield team that afternoon, and the ease had left his face like light leaving a room when someone draws the curtain. He had said yes. He had gone to the meeting. They had not had a morning like that since. Then James declined the Hartfield acquisition. It was the largest deal Callaway Group had pursued in a decade. $63 million, a clean vertical integration that would have tripled their logistics footprint in the Southeast. Margaret had spent 8 months engineering it. She had assumed James would step into the lead role. He was on the board. He was her son. The succession had been implicit for years, written in the DNA of every meeting she'd invited him to, every introduction she'd orchestrated, every role she'd quietly shaped for him to grow into. He had sent her a letter. Not a call, a letter, typed on plain paper, 3 paragraphs. He thanked her for the opportunity. He said he had been doing a great deal of thinking about his direction. He said he believed it was time for him to step back from the board and pursue work that felt, and here he had crossed out one word and written another, the correction visible in the printed text, some small human error that felt his. That felt his. Margaret had read the letter 4 times. She had called Ruth. She had walked around her office for 20 minutes without speaking. And then, in the particular way she had of making large decisions look like small ones, she had said, "I need to know what he really is. And there's only one way to find out." Ruth had told her it was a terrible idea. Margaret had not disagreed. She had made the calls anyway. The plan took 6 weeks to build. Dr. Harmon had agreed with the reluctance of a man who had known Margaret long enough to understand that her resistance to being argued with was not a mood but a feature. He signed what he needed to sign. He asked her, once, quietly, if she was all right. She told him she'd never been better. He did not believe her and did not press. Ruth had been harder. "You're going to break something that can't be fixed," Ruth had said, sitting across from Margaret in the farmhouse on the day they finalized the details. Ruth was 64, sensible-shoed, and had spent nearly 2 decades cleaning up the edges of Margaret's decisions. She had never said no. She had always said, "Are you sure? James isn't a stress test. He's your son." "I know what he is," Margaret had said. "Do you?" Ruth had looked at her for a long time. "Because it sounds like you're not sure. And that's the actual problem." Margaret hadn't answered. She'd looked out the window at the bare November field and thought about a boy with a fever and a woman who had promised, in the dark, to keep him safe from everything, including, it turned out, the truth. The obituary ran on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the condolence calls had started. By Thursday, Ruth had fielded 41 emails, 17 flower deliveries, and one journalist who wanted to write a retrospective piece on the woman who built Callaway from nothing. Ruth declined on behalf of the estate and forwarded the journalist's number to the PR firm that had handled Margaret's public image for the last decade. Then she drove to the farmhouse and sat across from Margaret with her hands folded on the table and said nothing for a long moment. "He hasn't called anyone," Ruth said finally. "I know. He hasn't issued a statement. The board is getting anxious." Ruth had managed the estate freeze with enough legal precision to hold the board in place for 90 days. No independent action, no emergency succession vote, the structure of Margaret's bylaws working in their favor for once. Let them be anxious. Ruth looked at the laptop screen. Margaret had been watching the live feed from the security camera positioned outside the Callaway Group headquarters. James had arrived at 8:47 that morning, an hour earlier than his usual time. He had not left. "What is he doing in there?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet." The camera showed the building's entrance. She watched a courier arrive and leave. She watched Gerald Fitch, silver-haired, perpetually anxious board member, enter at 10 and exit at 11 with the tight expression of a man who had not gotten what he came for. She tried to read James in Gerald Fitch's face and found only Gerald Fitch. The whispers started within 48 hours. They always did, in the circles Margaret had moved through for 30 years. The question of what James would do was not merely a personal matter in those circles. It was a restructuring question, a market question. "He didn't cry," she heard, secondhand, through Ruth. A comment made at a reception she hadn't attended because she was dead, not once. "Cold as his mother, but without the bite. He's waiting," someone else had apparently said. "Give him 2 weeks. He'll have advisors in there, restructuring everything." Margaret had heard these things and felt something complicated, not pride, not vindication, but a faint nausea she couldn't name. These were her circles. These were people who had sat at her table, eaten her food, called her formidable, and meant it as a compliment. And they were looking at her son the way she had been looking at him, assuming the worst and calling it realism. She understood, for the first time, that she had taught them to do that. On the 9th day after the funeral, Ruth called with news. "He's requested a 90-day hold on all major financial decisions, pending review. The board isn't happy." "What kind of review?" "He's not reviewing the investment portfolio. He's not looking at the acquisition pipeline." A pause. "He pulled the charitable foundation records, the discretionary fund ledgers, the personal correspondence files from your assistant." Margaret was quiet. "He's also been in your old office," Ruth added. "The one you kept on the 4th floor. Building management confirmed he's been there 3 times this week." Margaret had kept that office for reasons she would have denied if asked. It was the first space that had been truly hers, small, corner-facing, with a window that looked out over a parking structure and, if you leaned slightly, a strip of the river beyond. She had moved to the larger suite on the 14th floor 12 years ago and kept the 4th floor office locked. She hadn't told James about it. He had found it on his own. She thought about what was in there. The desk, the bookshelves, the framed quote on the wall she'd torn from a magazine in 1987. And in the bottom drawer she thought about the bottom drawer. On day 14, James sold the Patek Philippe. Margaret found out through Ruth, who had a contact at the auction house. The watch had been a gift for James's 25th birthday, a Saturday in March, when she had taken him to dinner and given him the watch in a blue box across a white tablecloth and said something about legacy and time. He had thanked her. He had worn the watch twice, that she knew of. He sold it for $42,000. The proceeds were wired to an account Ruth was still tracing. 2 days later, he vacated the penthouse apartment Margaret had helped him secure 6 years ago and moved into a 2-bedroom unit near Callaway Group's original offices in Midtown. The building had a broken elevator and a corner bodega on the ground floor. It was the kind of place Margaret had clawed her way out of. It was the kind of place her son had chosen to move into. She didn't understand it. She turned it over the way she turned over problems she couldn't solve yet, looking for the angle, the logic, the calculation behind it. He was liquidating comfort. He was shedding the exterior of the life she'd constructed around him. People who did that were either in crisis or in pursuit of something. She couldn't tell which. On day 19, Ruth sent her a photograph. It was James, taken from a distance, standing outside a yellow duplex in Decatur. He was talking to a woman Margaret didn't recognize at first, middle-aged, with the posture of someone who had spent years doing physical work. They were standing on the front porch. James was listening. The woman was talking with her hands. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time before she recognized the address. Donna Marsh. She hadn't thought about Donna Marsh in years. The situation had been handled quietly. The way Margaret handled things, she felt guilty about through the Callaway Foundation's discretionary fund, routed through a third-party scholarship organization, anonymized completely. Donna had been a warehouse coordinator, one of a dozen operations staff let go during a restructuring Margaret had authorized in 2009. The layoffs had been legal. They had also been wrong, and Margaret had known it the moment the paperwork crossed her desk and signed it anyway because the quarter needed to close clean. She had not told anyone what she did after. Donna's daughter had gotten 2 years of vocational training. Margaret had never expected acknowledgement. She had done it because she was standing in her 4th-floor office one night, looking out at the parking structure, thinking about a 9-year-old in a Baltimore apartment and what would have happened if someone had helped. James had found Donna anyway. Ruth had positioned herself near the duplex that day. She called Margaret that evening. He stayed for 2 hours. Donna talked most of it. A pause. She told him about the scholarship. She said she'd only just found out it came from your foundation. Someone at the vocational school had let it slip recently. She said she'd been trying to find a way to say thank you for years. Margaret said nothing. James didn't say much. He mostly listened. But at one point he asked her what you were like, what you seemed like, the times they'd interacted before the layoffs. And Donna said you were the hardest person to read she'd ever worked for. She said you never seemed to need anything from anyone. Ruth paused. But she said one time, during a site visit, she'd seen you crouch down to talk to a little kid who was waiting for his mother in the break room. She said you talked to him for 10 minutes like he was the most important person in the building. Margaret stared at the wall. She said she never forgot that. She said she used to think about it when the news was hard, and she wanted to be angry at you. She said it complicated things. There was a long silence on the line. He didn't say anything after that? Margaret finally asked. He thanked her. He stood up to leave. Ruth paused, and then he sat back down, and he said, "I'm sorry, she never got to hear this herself." Margaret ended the call. She sat in the cedar-smelling room with the single lamp and the cold coffee, and she thought about a boy who had driven to Decatur on a weekday to sit on a stranger's porch and listen to stories about a woman he thought he'd lost, who had said, "I'm sorry she never got to hear this," in a voice Ruth described as wrecked. She thought about everything she'd been so certain of 6 weeks ago. She thought about the look on a boy's face, 7 years old and burning with fever, when she'd walked into that hospital room and he'd said "Mom," like the word itself was the cure. She thought about how long ago that was, how many decisions she'd made since then in the name of protecting him, how many of those decisions he'd experienced, not as protection but as weight. The camera on the laptop showed the empty farmhouse driveway, the field beyond it, dark and still. Margaret sat in the room she'd chosen for its lack of windows, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she did not feel like a woman running a careful plan. She felt like a woman who had made a very serious mistake. Marcus Webb had known James Callaway for 22 years, since the 3rd week of freshman year at Whitmore Academy, when James had sat down uninvited at Marcus's lunch table and said, without preamble, "You look like you don't want to be here either." They had been friends since that afternoon, in the way that certain friendships form not through shared enthusiasm but through shared exhaustion, A mutual recognition of the cost of performing for rooms that expected performance. They had drifted in the way adult lives drift. Marcus was in Atlanta now, running a mid-size architecture firm, married with 2 kids. They texted occasionally. They had seen each other twice in the last 4 years. James called him on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the funeral. Marcus called back within 10 minutes, and James answered on the first ring. They talked around it for a while. Then there was a pause, the kind that in their particular friendship meant someone was about to say the actual thing. "Can I ask you something?" James said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. Have you ever loved someone and had no idea how to be around them?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Are we talking about your mother?" "Yeah." "Then yes. I think that's one of the more common things humans experience." James made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Every time I did something different from what she'd planned, I could see it, in her face, this flicker, like a calculation resetting. And I told myself it was disappointment. For years I told myself that. But I think it might have been fear. I think she was scared, and I read it as judgment, and by the time I figured out there might be a difference, I'd already built so much distance that I didn't know how to close it without admitting how long I'd kept it. Marcus waited. "I was terrified of her face," James said quietly. "Not because she was cruel. She wasn't cruel. She wanted so much. And I could never tell if I was what she wanted or just the closest available material." The line was quiet for a long moment. "I keep going to these places she apparently helped people. People I didn't know about. There's a woman in Decatur, and a man in Savannah she put through a technical program. I found a letter in her office from a school in rural Georgia. Thank you for the anonymous gift, and I didn't know." His voice compressed briefly. "I lived 32 years with her, and I didn't know the half of who she was. You're finding out now." "Yeah, after." The word landed flat and final. "James, that's not nothing. Finding out is not nothing." James didn't respond to that directly. "I keep thinking she's gone, and the clearest picture I have of her is the one I'm building now, from other people's stories." "What does that say about how I—" He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. Marcus stayed on the line for another hour, mostly listening. When they hung up, he sat in his kitchen in Atlanta for a long time before going to bed. In the farmhouse, Margaret had heard enough. "Stop the phone monitoring," she said when Ruth called with the summary. "I don't want to hear his private conversations anymore. I've seen enough." Ruth nodded and made the call to cancel the service. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that what Margaret had seen had not clarified the picture but reversed it entirely. On day 26, Ruth got eyes in the 4th-floor office through a camera fitted into the smoke detector casing during a routine building inspection. It was the last surveillance Margaret authorized. The footage showed James on a Tuesday afternoon. He had not redecorated. He had not moved anything. He turned on the desk lamp and pulled a chair up to the bookshelves, leafing through her books slowly, occasionally stopping on a page. Then, he opened the bottom drawer of the desk. The drawer contained a metal box, unlocked, holding the things she'd accumulated over the years that she hadn't been able to throw away. James lifted the box out and raised the lid. She watched him lift out a photograph, a Polaroid from 1998, James at 4 years old in a yellow rain jacket, laughing at something off-camera. The laugh of a child who had not yet learned to be careful. He looked at it for a long time. Then, he found the letters. There were 11 of them, notes she had written James over the years, for birthdays and first days of school, and one for the night before his college graduation, when she had stayed up too late and written more than she intended. She had folded that last letter, addressed the envelope, and then put it in the drawer instead of sending it. She had never found the right moment. She had eventually stopped looking. He read them slowly, one by one, setting each one face down on the desk after he finished. When he finished the graduation letter, the longest, the most unguarded, he sat very still with his hands flat on the desk. Margaret's hand was pressed against her mouth. She didn't realize she was crying until she felt the wet on her fingers. She watched her son sit in her old office in the lamplight, surrounded by unsent letters and a photograph of a laughing 4-year-old, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had been wrong, not partially wrong, wrong in the specific, irreversible way that matters. She had looked at a person she loved and decided she already knew what he was, and she had been so committed to that knowing that she had built a plan around it, and the plan was already doing damage she was only beginning to measure. On day 31, James filed articles of incorporation for a new nonprofit. Ruth found out through her contacts at the state registration office. The nonprofit's stated purpose was the provision of housing assistance, child care support, and vocational resources to single mothers and their children in underserved Atlanta communities. Its name, filed in the articles, was the Margaret House. Ruth called Margaret at 7 in the morning. She read the name twice, to make sure. Margaret sat in the farmhouse kitchen with the phone against her ear and the name moving through her like something she had no category for. She thought about the plan in her desk at home, the actual physical document, 12 pages of notes and projections and program outlines she'd started in 2011 and returned to intermittently for years without ever committing. The plan for a center for women who were where she had been. She had never talked about it publicly. She had mentioned it once to Ruth, who had said it sounded like a good idea, and moved on. James had found the plan in the fourth-floor office. He had found a 12-year-old document she had never shown him, and he had taken it and named a nonprofit after her and filed the paperwork. The watch money. The penthouse. This was where it had gone. He's not taking a salary, Ruth said, reading from the documents. He listed himself as a volunteer board member. He's secured a space on Ponce de Leon, a former daycare facility. He's brought in a program director. He's moving fast. Margaret looked out the farmhouse window at the bare field under low clouds. She thought about James on Donna's porch. She thought about James with the unsent letters. She thought about James on the phone with Marcus, saying I could never tell if I was what she wanted. She thought about a boy at 7 years old, saying mom like the word was the cure. She had wanted to know what he would do without her. Now she knew. And the knowledge was not the vindication she had built this for. It was something closer to collapse. The night before the center's opening, at 11:40, Ruth appeared outside the building on Ponce de Leon. She had come on her own, no instruction from Margaret, no camera or device. She had simply driven there because she had known James would still be inside, and she had wanted to know he was all right. She stood outside in the cold, and through the glass she could hear him. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was alone, and he was talking anyway, the way people talk in churches or cemeteries or places that feel like they hold something larger than the present moment. Ruth called Margaret and opened the line without speaking. She held the phone up toward the glass. I don't know if this is any good, James said. His voice was quiet and unguarded, stripped of the flatness he used in public. I don't know if it's what you had in mind. I tried to follow the plan you had, the square footage, the intake model, the emphasis on job training over dependence. I think you would have moved the reception desk. You always move the reception desk. You said it has to say you belong here before anyone opens their mouth. A pause. I didn't know how to be around you. I want you to know that it wasn't. I wasn't indifferent. I was scared. I was scared my whole life of doing it wrong in front of you. And then I ran out of time to do it right. His voice held there, just barely. I know it's too late. But I still wanted you to see this. The line was quiet, just James in the dark of a room that had his mother's name on the wall outside. Margaret put her free hand flat against the kitchen table. She had staged a death to find out what her son was made of. She had found out. What she had found was not greed, not calculation, not the cold maneuvering of a man who had been waiting for his inheritance. What she had found was a son who did not know how to be close to her, had never known, had spent 32 years at a carefully maintained distance, and who, the moment he thought she was gone, had spent every resource he had trying to finish what she started, who had driven to Decatur to hear a stranger talk about her, who had read 11 unsent letters by lamplight and kept them all, who was standing alone in a building with her name on it, talking to the dark. She had made a mistake of the first order, not a tactical mistake, not a strategic error, but the kind of mistake that only love-frightened, armored, insufficient love is capable of making. She had looked at her son through the lens of her own oldest wound and decided he was the wound. She had been wrong. She picked up her keys. She drove herself. Margaret Calloway had not driven herself anywhere significant in 11 years. But at 11:53, On a Wednesday night, she backed the farmhouse's old Subaru out of the gravel driveway and drove the 40 miles toward the city alone, in the dark, in clothes she had been wearing since morning. Ruth had texted once. "Are you sure?" Margaret had not answered. She thought about what she was going to say. She had made presentations before audiences of thousands. She had sat across negotiating tables from men twice her size and half her competence, and she had not flinched. She knew how to find words for hard things. She could not find the words for this. She was not looking for words, she realized, as the city lights appeared on the horizon. She was going because she had heard her son talking to a room that had her name on it, and the sound of it had moved through her like a door coming off its hinges. And some things cannot be organized. Some things can only be gone toward. She parked 3 blocks from the building. She walked the rest. The street was quiet commercial strip, mostly dark. A late-night diner 2 doors down throwing yellow light across the sidewalk. The building sat between a dry cleaner and a vacant lot. 2 stories of reclaimed brick with new windows and a freshly painted door. Above the door, in clean sans serif letters, the Margaret House. She stopped on the sidewalk. She had known it was there. Ruth had sent her a photo of the sign going up 2 days ago. Seeing it in a photograph was one thing. Standing underneath it in person was something else entirely. Something that required her to stand very still and feel the full weight of what her son had done in her name, with her plan, without ever once asking her permission. The light was on inside. She tried the door. Unlocked. James had always been careless about locking up, a habit that had irritated her for years, and she felt, absurdly, a wave of something warm at the evidence of that familiar carelessness. She pushed the door open and went inside. The front room was larger than she'd expected. High ceilings, exposed ductwork, painted a clean white, warm Edison bulbs on track lighting. A reception desk stood just inside the entrance, positioned slightly off-center from the standard layout, angled toward the door, so you could see the person coming in before they reached you. So the first thing anyone saw was someone already turned toward them, already oriented in welcome. She had written that in the 12-year-old document. She had never expected anyone else to read it. She walked toward the corridor, toward the light beyond. The main room was a large open space. Folding chairs stacked neatly along one wall. Round tables in a loose cluster. On the far wall, a mural, warm colors, abstract shapes that resolved, if you stood at the right distance, into the silhouette of a woman holding a child's hand. James was standing beneath the mural. He had his back to her. He was looking up at the painted wall with his hands in his pockets, still in the same clothes he'd worn that morning, the dark gray jacket, the worn-through elbows. He heard her footsteps and turned. The silence was total. Margaret watched her son's face move through things she could not name individually. They came too fast and overlapped, a system of weather passing over terrain she knew the geography of, but had never seen in conditions like these. His eyes moved from her face to her hands, to her face again, the way people look at things they are not sure are real. "I'm dreaming," he said. His voice was flat, informational, the voice of someone whose processing had exceeded capacity and defaulted to the simplest possible output. "No," Margaret said. "You're not." She had rehearsed, in the car, some version of the opening. She had not found it. She did not find it now. "I'm sorry," she said. It was insufficient. She knew it was insufficient. She said it anyway, because it was true, and because she was 61 years old and had spent most of those years saying the precise right thing, and she was done with precision. James stepped back, one step, then another, his body making the decision independently. His back came close to the wall beneath the mural. He stopped there, looking at her like something had been taken from him, and he hadn't yet decided whether it would be returned. "You were alive," he said. "Yes. The whole time. Yes." The word landed in the room and stayed. She watched his jaw tighten, the particular signature she had seen 1,000 times without understanding its source. "You thought I needed to be tested." "I was afraid," Margaret said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." She kept her voice level, not because she felt level, but because levelness was the only container she knew for things that were too large for ordinary expression, and she recognized now that she had passed that pattern directly to her son, without understanding the cost. I was afraid you didn't. I was afraid that what was between us wasn't real. I didn't know how to ask. I have never in my life known how to ask for the thing I needed most. So I built a test instead. Because tests have outcomes I could prepare for, and conversations with you. Her voice stopped for a moment, started again. Conversations with you were the one thing I could never prepare for. Because you're the one person whose answer I couldn't afford to get wrong. Something moved across James's face. He was quiet for a long time. Somewhere outside, a siren passed and faded. I drove to Decatur, he said finally, his voice lower now. To find people you'd helped. I didn't know any of it. I thought I knew who you were, and he made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. There were 11 letters in a box in your drawer. You wrote them. You kept them. I never sent them, Margaret said. Why? The simplest question she'd been asked in 30 years. The one she had the least prepared answer for. Because I was afraid the moment had passed, she said. And then, because I was afraid the next moment had passed. And eventually, she looked at her son across the room, standing beneath a mural of a woman and a child, in a building he'd made from her blueprints, and her name and money he'd taken from his own life. Eventually, I ran out of moments, and I still hadn't sent them. The silence stretched. Then James said, I never left, because I didn't care. Margaret went very still. I want to say that clearly because I don't know if I've ever. He paused. His hands came out of his pockets. He crossed his arms, not in the closed posture it might have appeared from outside, but in the way people hold themselves when they are handling something fragile and have no table to set it on. I left because I didn't know how to stay and feel like myself at the same time. Every time I did something that wasn't what you planned, I saw that look, that flicker. I know, Margaret said. I read it as. I know what you read it as. It wasn't that I stopped. I know. Her voice cracked on the second syllable the first time in the conversation, possibly the first time in a decade. James, I know. I was afraid, and you read it as judgment, because I went silent so many times when I should have spoken. That is not your failure. That is mine. He uncrossed his arms. The room was very quiet. I named it after you, he said. Not as an explanation, as information offered in lieu of the thing that couldn't be said directly. As, I loved you, when I had no other way to show it. I know, Margaret said. I read the filing. He made the sound again, the almost laugh, and this time, it was real enough to change the temperature of the room by a fraction of a degree. Margaret felt it. She crossed the room, not quickly. She moved with the deliberateness of someone who understood that what she was approaching was fragile, and that the approach itself was part of the message. She stopped 2 feet from him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face. 32 days of grief and discovery and solitary labor that he'd carried without telling anyone it was grief. She extended her hand, not reaching for him, not pulling him toward her, just her hand in the space between them, open, palm up, the gesture of someone offering rather than taking. James looked at her hand for a long time, long enough that she wondered if this was the moment it didn't work, the moment where the damage was simply too old and too deep to be undone by a woman standing with her palms open at midnight. Then he put his hand in hers. Not a hug, not a collapse, just his hand in her hand, in the room that had her name on it, in the city where they had both spent their lives passing each other in the hallways of a relationship neither of them had known how to unlock. Margaret closed her fingers around his hand. She did not speak, neither did he. They stood there in the building he had made from her blueprints, in the room where women who needed someone to show up would someday come and find someone who had, and the silence between them was not the silence of distance but the silence of 2 people who had finally run out of ways to avoid each other and found, on the other side of all that avoidance, that the thing they'd been protecting was still there. It was not easy after that. She had not expected easy. There were conversations that did not go smoothly, conversations where James walked away mid-sentence and came back 20 minutes later, conversations where Margaret said the wrong thing in the right direction and had to reverse and try again. Ruth had been right that you couldn't undo something like this in a night. You could start. You could, if both people chose it, keep starting, one conversation at a time, until the starting became a habit and the habit became something else. The board of Callaway Group was told, 6 weeks after the opening, once Margaret and James had determined together what the story would be that Margaret was alive. The explanation was implausible, and everyone involved knew it. Several board members resigned. Gerald Fitch sent a card with a handwritten note, "I'm glad you're not dead, even if the method was unsound." She kept the card. Dr. Harmon retired shortly after. Ruth stayed. Ruth had always stayed. Marcus Webb came to the center's second open house at James's invitation. He shook Margaret's hand in the doorway and said, without ceremony, "He talked about you like you hung the moon. I thought you should know that." Then he went inside to find James, and Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment before following. The Margaret house opened with 14 families in its first intake cohort. A local news crew came and left without a comment from Margaret, who had asked James to handle the public-facing work on the grounds that it was his project and his name on the board. He had looked at her with something uncomplicated in his face, something she had not seen in years, and gone out to talk to the crew. She stood in the back of the main room on opening day and watched the families come in. Young mothers with children on their hips, moving with the alertness of people who have learned not to assume that good things stay. Women arriving alone, shoulders coming down by degrees as they found that the space looked like what it said it was. A girl of perhaps 8, who let go of her mother's hand immediately and walked to the window and pressed her nose against the glass to look at the street. The reception desk was staffed by a young woman named Alicia who turned toward each person before they reached her. James had done the training. Margaret had read the notes. The instruction was simple: make eye contact from across the room. Before anyone opens their mouth, let them know they are seen. Margaret watched Alicia catch the eye of a woman in a yellow coat and smile before the woman had taken 3 steps past the door. She watched the woman absorb the smile and stand up slightly straighter. James appeared beside her without announcement, the way he had moved as a child, quietly, suddenly present. "The reception desk looks right," she said. "I moved it twice. I would have moved it 3 times. He was quiet for a moment. "You can still move it." She looked at him. He was watching the room with the particular satisfaction of someone who had translated something imagined into something standing. She recognized the expression. She had worn it herself in other rooms at the end of other long efforts. She had spent 32 years trying to make him into the continuation of what she had built. What he had become was something she hadn't thought to plan for someone who had taken her blueprints and her wounds and her unsent letters and made something that was both hers and entirely his own. That was better than continuation. That was inheritance of the kind that actually lasts. The girl at the window turned away from the glass. She ran back across the room and found her mother's hand, and her mother lifted her, and for a moment, the two of them stood together in the light that came through the clean new windows of a building that had started as a fear and become, through a long series of painful corrections, something closer to love. Margaret stood beside her son and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and because she had spent enough of her life filling silence with the wrong words, and she was, at 61, finally learning the difference between silence that is distance and silence that is home.